Hi, my name is Jackson Anderson. This is my project on the consumer's perceptions of the therapeutic and growth-promoting use of antibiotics in poultry production. This is prepared for the AP Capstone Review Panel. So the purpose of my project is to investigate the perceptions of Hillsborough County consumers regarding the use of antibiotics for both therapeutic and growth-promoting purposes in the U.S. poultry industry. So important terms to know before I delve into my topic would of course be antibiotics, which are medicinal treatments used to target microorganisms that cause disease, and then the different uses of antibiotics. The first being therapeutic purposes. Therapeutic purposes are truly to treat, control, and prevent poultry disease, while growth-promoting purposes are when antibiotics are used as feed additives to enhance weight gain. Ionophores are antibiotics used specifically for poultry diseases. Perceptions are the understanding or impression of an entity or concept, and the agricultural literacy is the alignment of one's perceptions with the literature and the reality of the agribusiness topic. With these in mind, we can now look at the literature that led me to my purpose and inspired me overall. And these can be broken up into 4 different categories. The first being the antibiotic-resistant microbial controversy. Antibiotics have been used in the poultry industry since the 1940s for both therapeutic and growth-promoting purposes. However, as our understanding of microorganisms and their ability to become resistant to treatments when used in excessive quantities, people began to fear some antibiotic uses, notably for the non-judicious use of growth promotion. In order to investigate this, the Joint Expert Workshop was launched in 2003, which involved the World Health Organization, which has found that the regulations currently in place for the use of antibiotics were inadequate and that the use of them overall should be limited further. However, despite these changes here and these findings here, other studies in place found that the use of antibiotics is far more complicated. Kaidana's 1999 study looked into genomic relationships between poultry-specific disease and its spread to human and found they are not homologous with human strains. Therefore, the spread of poultry disease to humans is far more complicated, and switching to organic farms, those completely free of all antibiotic treatments, does not necessarily mean less bacteria resistant to humans in human cases. Hugh et al. Study looked into those organic farms and found that even when you switch to organic antibiotic-free treatments, you're not necessarily making the poultry healthier. In fact, organic farms had 3 times the rates of Campylobacter, one of the 3 highest poultry to human diseases in existence, as opposed to their conventional antibiotic-treated counterparts. What this controversy overall shows us is that the just use for therapeutic methods keeps the poultry healthier and makes it safer for humans to consume, while the unjust and non-judicious use for growth promotion is too excessive and can lead to resistant bacterials. The next portion is the government responses to this controversy. The World Health Organization investigated DANMAP in 2002. Essentially, DANMAP was a Denmark initiative to severely limit the use of antibiotics in the poultry industry throughout the 90s, most notably those for growth promotion, with the idea of stunting the spread of bacteria resistant to human medicine. What actually they found was the opposite. In fact, as you can see by this chart here, the rates of Salmonella, Campylobacter, and E. coli increased or was unaffected by this limitation of antibiotics. And what this found was that blanket limitations on antibiotic use, especially for therapeutic, does not lessen the effect of bacteria resistant to human cases. It actually increases and has the reverse effect. Despite all of this, the United States jumped on board with the Europeans and released the Guidance for Industries, which was essentially a string of our own versions of DANMAP to limit antibiotic use overall, and ended with most recently Guidance for Industry number 213, released in 2013 and took full effect in 2017, which banned the use of all antibiotics in the U.S. poultry industry deemed important or higher by the World Health Organization, and only allowed those that were not important, such as ionophores, to be used with veterinary approval. What this essentially did was severely constrict and limit the industry's ability to treat their chickens therapeutically and make it healthier for their consumers, allowing the private sector to take advantage. So despite DANMAP and other studies showing that blanket limitations on all antibiotic use is dangerous and can lead to more poultry-specific diseases and resistance to human treatments, there must be some kind of outside source causing the legislation to move in such an anti-antibiotic direction. This is likely private sector responses to the controversy. These are mainly by both activist groups and poultry producers themselves. Activist groups such as the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, PETA, or the Humane Society of the United States have for years been attacking the overall use of antibiotics to drive their own individual agendas of anti-meat consumption. They've lumped together the different uses of antibiotics, such as therapeutic and growth promotion, without differentiating the two. They've linked the use of therapeutic treatments to anorganic arsenicals, which have been illegal since 2015 anyways. And they've listed off all the different kinds of antibiotics previously used in chicken treatments without differentiating those important to human medicine and those that are purely ionophores, and without talking about the complicated process that it actually takes for resistant bacteria to spread to human cases. The other group are the poultry giants such as Purdue and Tyson. The antibiotic-free label has for years been the key point of this whole marketing scheme's idea. Antibiotic-free labeling can actually have three different definitions. It can mean that the antibiotic was only used for therapeutic purposes, that is, no growth promotion, but we know that since the guidance version number 213, that has been illegal anyways, so it means nothing. It can mean that no antibiotic residues are present in the meat of chickens treated with antibiotics, which has been illegal by the FDA's compliance program for years, as it comes anyways. Or it can mean that no antibiotics were ever used in the production of the bird, which we know from Hewer et al. Study, and that it actually means that means that it's 3 times more susceptible to poultry-specific disease. So overall, any variation of this antibiotic-free label is not healthy to consumers, yet it's been used to allow the private sector to increase their poultry products prices for their own economic gains. The most recent one is the No Antibiotics Ever campaign, launched by Tyson and Purdue, which essentially means that they've cut out all antibiotic treatments in the industry, therapeutic and the non-judicious use of growth promotion. This means that their birds are not only more susceptible to disease, but cost far more for the consumers to purchase. The final piece of the literature to look at is the previous studies of agricultural literacy. Hess and Treckler's investigation of the urban youth's perceptions of the industry in 2011, and Kovar and Ball's investigation of the perceptions in agricultural literacy themselves in 2013 found that not only are the overarching topics of agribusiness very unknown to consumers, but the methods used to gauge such agricultural literacies are severely outdated. CITED et al.'s study in 2015 found that only the overarching topics of agribusiness have been looked at when it comes to consumers' perceptions, and not the specific areas such as antibiotic use. What this altogether tells us and synthesizes is that the consumer's knowledge of the overarching agribusiness is severely underdeveloped, and the individual areas such as antibiotic use, like therapeutic versus growth promotion, has not been investigated thoroughly. This gap in the research led to my call for investigation altogether with the other literature, and told us this: we can assume from the private sector and governmental responses to the controversy, as well as the lacking consumer agricultural literacy found by the studies of the consumer's perceptions previously, that there is a possible skewed public opinion against overall antibiotic use, as opposed to just the non-judicious use of growth promotion and the just treatment for therapeutic purposes. The significance of all of this is that the consumer's perceptions shape the industry. What the consumers want and believe is going to be what the poultry producers and the government have to do in response in order to drive their own agendas in the right direction. So this tells us that understanding the consumer's perceptions of the antibiotic use will allow us to take the appropriate recognition of the dangers at hand. Once we understand just how out of touch the consumers are, we'll have a way better opportunity of addressing the issue of lacking agricultural literacies and prevent the legislation to continually move in an anti-antibiotic overall direction. In order to investigate this, I finally came to the purpose of my research, was again, to investigate the perceptions of Hillsborough County consumers, their agricultural literacies, regarding the use of antibiotics for both therapeutic and growth promoting purposes in the US poultry industry. To do this leads me to my methods section. In order to achieve this purpose, I used a research design of a descriptive mixed method research approach, which implemented both quantitative data and quantized qualitative data. In order to achieve this, I used a questionnaire of 5 to 7 minutes given out to the consumers on an online medium. And in order to gain the quantitative data, I used confined possible answers. And in order to gain the qualitative data, which was later quantized, I used open-ended questions. This can be clearly seen in this excerpt from my survey, where you can see the multiple choice confined answer response quantitative data, as well as the complemented and clarifying qualitative open-ended questions. Altogether, this allowed me to triangulate the data and find out the true agricultural literacies of the consumers. These were given out to participants of Hillsborough County, the consumers as a whole, the generic consumer 18 and older, in order to ensure mature results. This sadly, of course, excluded 23% of the populace. So in order to distribute the survey, I used a three-step procedure. First, I sent out the survey link to the target demographic, and then I moderated the survey throughout the data collection period of February 12th to the 27th. And finally, I analyzed the quantitative and qualitative data that, of course, was quantized and used to complement and verify my quantitative results. And then, using this methodology, I was able to get my final results and the true perceptions of the consumers. So again, these results were meant to gauge the agricultural literacies of the consumers regarding both types of antibiotic uses in the U.S. poultry industry. I started off by looking at how significant this topic really is to consumers. It was found before I conducted the study that overall in the United States, 89% of consumers consume chicken at least once a week. In my study of just Hillsborough County, 96% of consumers and participants consume chicken or purchase it at least once a week, meaning that legislation change for poultry products affects them on a daily basis. It's the top protein source found in this area, and it's extremely significant. Now, the results that I found regarding their agricultural literacies were very extreme, most notably those having to do with the prevalence of antibiotics used for growth-promoting purposes in the industry. We know that since Guidance for Industry number 213, it has been illegal to use antibiotics for growth-promoting purposes, but despite that, the vast majority shared underdeveloped agricultural literacies around this topic. Similarly, when you look at the possible link between the therapeutic use of antibiotics and the prevalence of bacteria resistant to human medicine, you find the same trend of underdeveloped agricultural literacies. People had no idea that the therapeutic treatments are completely unrelated to the growth of resistant bacteria to humans. And then, again, of course, the antibiotic residues being present in the meat of chickens treated with antibiotics. Despite it being illegal for chickens treated with antibiotics to carry these residues in their final products, the vast majority believed that it was the exact opposite and demonstrated severely underdeveloped agricultural literacies. And finally, you look at the different meanings and definitions of the antibiotic-free label. Again, despite it having three different meanings and all three having those contrary to the literature and the safety of the consumer, the vast majority had underdeveloped agricultural literacies. In fact, of the numerous different subjects that I gauged the agricultural literacies of when it came to consumers, only one area did the consumers show developed agricultural literacies for, and that was the price disparity between those products treated with antibiotics and those that were organic, with the majority, of course, saying that it was more expensive for organic products. Looking at the preferences that the consumers showed based on my research, the vast majority would rather purchase products that were never treated with antibiotics, and as we know before, makes them far more susceptible to disease. And the vast majority believe that there should be further limitations and restrictions on the poultry industry when it comes to antibiotic use. So despite having these severely underdeveloped agricultural literacies and being completely out of touch, the majority, nearly 70%, stated that this issue of antibiotic use in the industry is concerning to them. This tells us that the consumers not only are out of touch, but believe that their answers and that their perceptions are in touch. What this all tells us is that the consumers' agricultural literacies regarding this topic are extremely low and match the general trend of unbacked perceptions. The consumers are making their decisions based off of some sort of outside source, such as the private sector or governmental influences, rather than the true hardcore reality of the literature. It also tells us that the consumers are unknowingly supporting government and private sector initiatives to deteriorate poultry product quality by not having the education needed to challenge such legislation movement. they're unknowingly allowing the legislation to ban all antibiotic use. The limitations of my study are, of course, it's an online survey. I have no way of measuring how many times someone possibly takes it or their exact location. However, I don't think I have to worry about anybody wanting to take this survey more than once. Also, no ethnographic data was collected because I was purely looking at the generic Hillsborough County consumer. And finally, there was a very limited data collection period. If I had more time, I'd be able to get in contact with a larger swath of the population and get more accurate results. So the final conclusions are very general and straightforward, that the further consumer education is needed on this topic. The sooner that we can address this topic of severely underdeveloped agricultural literacies and teach the consumers directly from the agribusiness literature to the consumers, the sooner we can address this issue of legislation moving severely against all antibiotic use, and the sooner we can allow the poultry industry to properly treat their birds, ensuring both animal welfare and human welfare and safety. Future recommendations would of course have to be the causes of the lacking agricultural literacies. Is it purely the marketing gains by poultry giants, or is it from the activist groups in the other areas of the private sector? Or perhaps it's the government policy itself. People are purely buying into the guidance for industries and all that without doing their own research. Or maybe it's some unknown source. Whatever it is, figuring out what this purely theoretical agricultural literacy disparity is will allow us to address the issue directly rather than having to come to it once the legislation is already in place. And then a final recommendation is to look in the differences in perceptions amongst different ethnic and racial groups. In my study, I looked at just the generic consumer, but if there are any trends between different groups, we have a better understanding of why these perceptions are different and can tackle it in a safer way. And that's my project.
Good job. All right, question number one.
What was one of the most important sources that you used for doing your research?
The most important source was one that was given me directly by my advisor, very directly after I actually decided on my topic. I got in touch with Dr. Butcher from the University of Florida, who had just given a presentation on antibiotic use in China the week before. It was a very spectacular coincidence, but he was able to send me that presentation and allow me to understand what this topic was all about. Because up until then, I was investigating a completely different area of the poultry industry, having to do with inorganic arsenicals.
What do you predict to be some long-term real-world implications related to your topic?
So the real-world implications of this topic is that the guidance for industries aren't going to stop here. It's not going to stop with the spread of the No Antibiotics Ever campaign that we saw earlier. It's very fun, that. The private sector is taking advantage of this legislation movement against antibiotics that hasn't shown any signs of stopping, and the further restriction of the industry. We saw from my research that the vast majority of citizens think there should be further limitations and are going to support legislation and policy change in that direction. So this could mean that we're in a future where poultry simply doesn't have those therapeutic treatments to keep them healthy and the humans healthy that consume them.
Okay, two-part question.
Okay.
What unanticipated turn did you encounter as your research progressed, and what were the reasons for this change in direction or focus, and how did you modify your method or approach?
So this, of course, was my method overall. Originally, I planned on distributing my survey as a paper-based survey directly to consumers at different groceries throughout Hillsborough County. But when I contacted the corporate and the local managers, I found that they are completely against any kind of soliciting in that manner. So I had to switch to an online survey. But this, in the end, helped me to reach out to a larger swath of the county, because having an online survey and distributing it to the different middle school and high school principals throughout the county allow for a more even spread in the participation rate and therefore more accurate results to the true consumers' perceptions of the industry.
And I have some follow-up questions for you. You talked about distributing your survey to principals and how you captured an audience that way. Can you elaborate on that process?
Yeah, so I first converted my same paper-based survey to an online version, but then I emailed the principals of every high school and middle school and asked them to get in contact with their PTSA presidents, who would then further distribute it to the consumers. The good thing about this is that most PTSA members are members of my target demographic, and because it's such an open-ended generic question, they could further distribute it and eventually send my survey throughout the entirety of the county and get it to the most possible participants in the given time.
And then I have another follow-up to your first question. Tell us a little bit about your mentor and what was the most significant impact they had on your research direction.
When I originally was thinking my purpose of my project, I had a hard time coming up with the correct research question. In fact, I was investigating a completely unrelated topic that, unbeknownst to me, was very out of touch and was not a true research topic. I was looking into the prevalence of inorganic arsenicals in the industry, which since the FDA's withdrawals of roxarsone in 2013 and of natarstone in 2015, it's been completely illegal anyways. What my expert advisor told me, which was exactly that, was that the far more relevant version of that whole methods are being used to treat chickens was antibiotic use, which of course I had no idea. I was just like the consumers that I eventually measured the perceptions of. I didn't know the difference and I didn't know the importance. But once I looked at such as his presentation and further literature after that, I discovered this is a very important topic that is affecting us on a daily basis. I found out that the therapeutic use of antibiotics is under severe siege and that eventually it could be completely gone from our country.
All right, good job. Thank you so much.
Are you gonna send this? Is it Dr. Butcher?